To us about the garden. All right. Thanks, Adam.
Morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Before we do that, before we start, as some of you know, I just managed to get back from a youth retreat. Well, I made it back. I'm not sure if the others are going to make it back or not, but we were up at Peter and Sharon's cottage this past weekend, and so let me just give you a quick glimpse of our weekend. Yeah, that's not Anyways, just a quick glimpse of our weekend this past few days. I just wanted to say thank you for your support and encouragement of our youth here. It's a lot of fun working with them, and it's fun to spend some time away. I'm not sure that I got quite as much sleep over the last couple of days as I would normally have liked to, but that's part of the fun, actually. And I just want to say, so just thank you to all of you who also are involved, and people like Ron and Heidi this morning that scooted up to pick up people because I was coming back for this. Just people who are often behind the scenes, just willing to sort of pitch in and do little things, and it's fun to see. And as I think of this, I think of people like like Natalie. I just so impressed with this young girl that in sort of the awkward and grade 7er growing into a confident, mature young lady, and it's awesome. I love seeing what God's doing in Natalie's life, so that's kind of cool. Just one last thing before I dig into here is a quick note just for those of you who know Steph, who is also one of our youth leaders, who has been gone the last few months. This is her last weekend in Amsterdam, and she heads out to on an outreach team to the Middle East later this week. And so thank you for all of you who have supported her and are praying for her, and I just ask that you continue to do that as she heads into some more volatile areas of the world. And actually, just on the youth leaders, I just want to, just for you guys to know, like Patrick and Meg and Will, they're just a blast to work with, and they're doing an awesome job. So if you ever have a chance to encourage them, I'd appreciate it. This morning we're talking, it's Palm Sunday. And it's a very significant week in our calendar. Good Friday, Easter Sunday, and all the incredible significance of Easter. And I hope we take the time this week to reflect on the significance of that. The past number of weeks we've been reflecting on the upper room teachings. These John 13 to 17, almost a quarter of the book of John, taken up on this one-time teaching that Jesus had with his disciples. Kind of the final instructions and his prayer before journeying to the cross. And you can imagine the emotion that Jesus must have been feeling at that time as he shared with his disciples. He's the only one that really knows, who really understands what's to come. He knows this is his last time with his disciples before the cross. And then they begin to move from the cross and begin to journey, or move from the upper room and journey to the cross. And that journey begins in Gethsemane. And there's maybe no place where we're more up close to Jesus than in the Garden of Gethsemane. And that's what we're going to look at this morning. So we'll read where am I over here? So let me read the verses, John 18, verses 1 to 19. After saying these things, Jesus crossed the Kidron Valley with his disciples and entered a grove of olive trees. Judas, the betrayer, knew this place because Jesus had often gone there with his disciples. The leading priests and Pharisees had given Judas a contingent of Roman soldiers and temple guards to accompany him. Now with blazing torches, lanterns, and weapons, they arrived at the olive grove. Jesus fully realized all that was going to happen to him. So he stepped forward to meet them. "Who are you looking for?" he asked. "Jesus of Nazareth." "Jesus the Nazarene," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. As Jesus said, "I am he," they all drew back and fell to the ground. Once more he asked them, "Who are you looking for?" Again they replied, "Jesus the Nazarene." "I told you that I am he," Jesus said. "And since I am the one you want, let these others go." He did this to fulfill his own statement, "I did not lose a single one of those you have given me." Then Simon Peter drew a sword and slashed off the right ear of Malchus, the high priest's slave. But Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back into its sheath. Shall I not drink from the cup of suffering the Father has given me?" So the soldiers, their commanding officer, and the temple guards arrested Jesus and tied him up. First they took him to Annas, since he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest at that time. Caiaphas was the one who had told the other Jewish leaders, "It's better that one man should die for the people." Simon Peter followed Jesus, as did another of his disciples. That other disciple was acquainted with the high priest, so he was allowed to enter the high priest's courtyard with Jesus. Peter had to stay outside the gate. Then the disciple who knew the high priest spoke to the woman watching at the gate, and she let Peter in. The woman asked Peter, "You're not one of that man's disciples, are you?" "No," he said, "I'm not." Because it was cold, the household servants and the guards had made a charcoal fire. They stood around it, warming themselves. And Peter stood with them, warming himself. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for your love for us. And Father, as we remember this week and the significance of Easter, I just pray that you will just renew our hearts and touch our hearts once again with the power of the story of Jesus and his death on the cross. And so I just be with us this morning as we journey through this passage. You'll just give us the ears to hear and just give me the words to speak. Amen. So the journey to the cross begins at the olive grove, the Mount of Olives, or Gethsemane. Jesus knew as he left the upper room that this was going to be the most difficult journey in history. His most difficult act ever. He's going to bear the sins of the world. Separation from his Father. He was a most significant act as he heads out in really to reverse, as the second Adam, to reverse the actions of the first Adam back in the Garden of Eden. In this passage in John, verses 1 and there's more that we know from the other Gospels, that there's more that happens between sort of verse 1 and verse 2 than John gives us here. And so actually let me just read the little part that might from Luke that could be inserted in sort of between those verses. Luke 22, verse 39 to 44 says, Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. So they arrive at the garden, and Jesus instructs his disciples, "Watch and pray so that you don't fall into temptation." I wonder what those temptations were that Jesus was concerned with. Maybe there were temptations to run. Maybe the temptation to take things into their own hands. Maybe the temptation to deny him. Maybe the temptation to think they had been deceived, that the last 3 years had actually just been a waste. But it's through prayer that we are able to continue to see clearly, to see temptation for what it truly is, and overcome that temptation. So Jesus instructs his disciples, watch and pray so that you don't fall into temptation. And then Jesus goes off on his own a little bit and spends time with his Father. And time with his Father was the source of his strength. And he needed strengthening. We see this in this Luke's passage, that he needed strengthening. The depth of the agony as he cries out to his Father. I remember once Annika had something on her that needed to be removed surgically, and we were at a sort of an emergency clinic down in the States or whatever, and it needed to happen. I remember her, as it was going to happen, this little 7-year-old girl looking up to me was, "Daddy, please, no." And just the anguish in her eyes breaks your soul, and yet you know that for her, this needed to happen. And not to compare Annika's little need for a quick little surgery to Jesus and what he was going to suffer here, but a little glimpse of the agony of, please, no, please take this away from me. Mark 14:34 says, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." The depth of the sorrow that he was carrying, that he was overwhelmed with. And here in Luke it says that an angel appears and strengthens him. Jesus, the Son of God, needed this time with his Father to be strengthened. To have the strength to face what lay ahead. He understood the depth of what was going to happen. Separation from his Father. The consequences of sin for all mankind. The only way to have the strength to face what lay ahead was found in the garden. It was the source of his strength. It was also the source of his peace. Not my will, but yours. He came to be in tune with the Father's will. He accepted God's will. And he had, through that time with his Father, gained the peace to carry on. Sometimes God stills the storm of the sea. And other times, he stills the storm within us. And here is a time where the storm within Jesus is stilled. Max Lucado says in his book, And the Angels Were Silent, the battle is won. You may have thought it was won on Golgotha. It wasn't. You may have thought the sign of victory is the empty tomb. It isn't. The final battle was won in Gethsemane, and the sign of conquest is Jesus at peace in the olive trees. For it was in the garden that he made his decision. He would rather go to hell for you than go to heaven without you. Aligning his spirit with his Father through prayer is what made the difference. It was prayer that gave Jesus his strength and his courage. And I would encourage us that we need to spend time in prayer in order to know our Father's will, to be strengthened by him, to resist temptation, in order that we might fulfill our purpose. This time in the garden was not just because there was a crisis and he needed to go spend time with his Father. This is a regular habit throughout his life. It was a rhythm of his life. We see in Mark 1, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Luke 5, but Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. In John 6, Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. And then here in this one, Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. This is as usual to the place. It was a regular habit of his life. Judas knew, I know where Fred is. He's always going out there. It was a regular habit, a regular rhythm in his life. Jesus knew the importance of spending time with his Father, and he modeled that throughout his life. And so I guess I would just challenge us, what is our rhythm for going to the garden? Do we flow through life without taking meaningful time with the Father to align our will with his? If it's important for Jesus, it's important for us. And prayer is an invitation to deepen our intimacy with God. Prayer involves spending time with him in solitude, in silence, in Scripture. Psalm 46, verse 10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." The verse tells us there's a kind of knowing that comes in silence and not in words. We first need to be still. Actually, the Hebrew word translated "be still" actually means let go of your grip. And the importance of being still and knowing that we're God, that letting go of our grip on all the challenges, all the things that we face in our daily life that come at us, that we spend that time with our Father and actually let go of that grip that we carry with it and give it over to him. It's important for us to practice those spiritual rhythms in our own life, not only in times of crisis. Ruth Haley Barton, in Invitation to Silence, or Solitude and Silence, I love her work and many of her books on this topic. But here she says, "Because we do not rest, we lose our way. Poisoned by the hypnotic belief that good things come only through unceasing determination and tireless effort, we can never truly rest, and for want of rest, our lives are in danger." And then in Sacred Rhythm, she says, "Many of us try to shove spiritual transformation into the nooks and crannies of a life that is already unmanageable, rather than being willing to arrange our life for what our heart most wants. We think that somehow we will fall into transformation by accident." We need to spend that time in order to align our lives, to align our will with what the Father's will is, that we seek the Father's will and align ours to his, that we find that strength in those times, that peace that we find in those times. As many of you know, my sister-in-law is struggling, Thomas is struggling through and battling with cancer. And as an example of being desire to avoid the cup, to have it removed, but yet there are a few people that I've seen who are journeying through this with such strength and courage, ready to accept His will, and the strength and peace to face the journey that lies ahead. And that only comes through deep times with the Father, with an intimacy with the Father that can only be attained through time by being still in His presence. And so do we have challenges that lie ahead that we're not sure that we'll be able to handle? We all face challenges, but we often lack the rhythm of spending time with Him in solitude and silence, listening for His voice, accepting His will, and drawing the strength and peace we need to face these challenges. We need to spend that time in the garden if we are going to walk faithfully with Him. And that was Jesus. That was the example of Jesus and the time that He spent in the garden. We also see the disciples at this time in the garden. We don't see a whole lot of throughout the Gospels, much sign of them praying. Now, maybe it's just not mentioned, and that part is just not included in the writings that we have. But there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of engagement on their side of prayer. And in this part, we see that they actually are just regularly falling asleep. The disciples knew that this was important to Jesus, but we don't really see them engaging with it. They ask at one point, "Lord, teach us to pray." And it's good to learn. It's good to ask that question. It's good to learn how to pray, learn all kinds of things. And there's great books out there. Yancey has some good stuff. Henry Nouwen's stuff is great. I love Ruth Haley Barton's material. There's great stuff there that we can learn about our growth in this areas. But sometimes I think we substitute doing with learning. A number of years ago, for those who've been around for a few years, we had one of our objectives for Bethel one of them was to encourage learning by doing. That we learn by actually doing things. And it's in actually doing things that we learn. And I think so often, I myself can feel like, oh, I've just spent a good time in prayer and intimacy with God because I've been reading a book. And there's good, and there's elements of that. I'm not sort of discounting one or the other, and I think it's actually critical that we do learn and we spend time learning. But let's not just spend all of our time trying to learn about it and not actually just being still with our Father in the garden and developing that intimacy with Him. I hope that we will be a church that understands the importance of prayer and that learns how to pray by praying. That we don't just seek instruction about prayer or talk about prayer, but that we learn about it by doing it. And so those were the disciples. And then we have Peter. Peter, a man of action, always sort of being out there in front. And I love Peter because he's always out there ready to step out of the boat, ready for action. But we see here a little bit of the extremes that can happen when we don't have that time of intimacy with our Father. And Peter demonstrates these two extremes. First, he tries to defend Jesus, and then he denies Jesus. Kind of the polar opposite, the two extremes. And sometimes I think, first of all, he comes to Jesus' defense. And really this is an attack. He slashes with his sword at Marcus's ear. This is not a surgical little procedure where he pulls out a scalpel and takes off his ear and it's bad and everything else. But he has his sword. He takes it and slashes away at him. How much of the side of his face got chopped? I don't know. How much of his shoulder on the follow-through got hurt? But this is a slash that he's attacking the soldier with. Not little surgery. Yes, with the ear. I always sort of pictured the ear just the ear fell off. But this is a gruesome attack. There's probably lots of blood and screaming going on at this point. And I think sometimes we attack in Jesus' name, and we think that that justifies it. And I think sometimes we lash out, or I think Peter thought that that justified it because he was defending Jesus. But I think sometimes we can do the same. We can lash out and call it defending. We attack others in Jesus' name. Maybe it's other religions and other beliefs. Maybe it's the LGBTQ community. Maybe it's pro-life. Maybe it's the government. We may disagree. But I don't believe that the response is that we need to lash out and slash with our swords, chopping off their ears. I actually think it's kind of ironic that it's the ear that gets chopped off. Because I think sometimes when we lash out, that's what we do. We chop people's ears off. And they no longer can hear what we're trying to say. Because we've lashed at them. We've chopped the ear off. If there was ever a time in history that to defend someone, this was it. But Jesus doesn't need us to defend him. He says he could have called down 12 legions of angels to defend him. He doesn't need Peter to slash away. And I think through our attacks, we cut off other people's ears. We cut off their ability to hear. People no longer want to hear us and no longer have the ability to hear us. It's the only way they will hear is when Jesus reaches down and picks up his ear and places it back and heals Marcus, that he will again be able to hear. And may we never try to justify our attacks on others by saying we are defending Jesus. Rather, may our lives pour forth the healing love of Jesus, touching people's ears so that they can hear again. So that's his attack, his defense. And then he denies him. Peter's standing around the fire, and he just wants to blend in. He just wants to be accepted. He wants to be like everyone else around him. I think sometimes that's kind of our other extreme, isn't it? We just want to blend in. We want to be kind of a chameleon Christian in the world in which we live. Inwardly, we have a faith. Outwardly, we want to look like everyone around us. We want to enjoy the things of the world. We want to be in and of the world. And I think the message that we communicate to the world around us when we do that is that why would they bother with faith? Jesus obviously makes no difference. So why would they believe what we have when they don't see any difference that makes in our life? I think it's really cool that Peter doesn't stay here, though. There's a transformation in Peter's life that happens a couple of chapters later, after the cross, in John 21. Peter's head is probably exploding at this point. He had attacked, he had denied, and then he had seen the whole actions of the cross, the resurrection, he'd seen Jesus, and here he is, head probably swelling with guilt, disappointment in himself, bewilderment. And so what does he do? He goes fishing. Tries to escape. Run away from it. Back to his comfort zone. Back to fishing that he knew, and he knew what to do, and that was comforting. But as we know, they fish with the other disciples, they fish all night, and there's no fish. And Jesus comes along the shore and says, how about you cast the nets on the other side? So they do, and the boat overflows. And Jesus had just taught the disciples in the upper room about bearing fruit. That without me you will bear no fruit. With me you will bear much fruit. Remain in me. And I think there's an element there of comparing that to what Peter's just done out in the boat fishing. Peter tries to escape, to be away from Jesus. And he bears no fruit. There are no fish. And then he accepts Jesus' words. And he moves into his presence, and the nets begin to overflow. And then we see Jesus questioning Peter over breakfast. And I think there's a real huge transformational moment here in Peter's life when Jesus questions him around the fire, and he says, "You know that I love you," is Peter's response. He finds rest and peace in Jesus. And this Peter, who had tried to defend him, and then he denied him, discovered an intimacy with Jesus he had likely never experienced. I love that we see this picture of Peter, because his mistakes and the failures of this pillar of the church gives me hope, because I constantly fail. But Jesus sees beyond my failures. He loves me despite my faults. Those are the sins that he's paid for. Jesus never gives up on me. In John 18, verse 9, one of the verses, it says, "I have not lost one of those." So I think often our natural result of a lack of intimacy, a lack of time with the Father, is to attack others or to deny him. Rather than protecting Jesus, I pray that we will be the ones reaching out to heal the ears of those who are hurting and confused around us. Rather than seeking to be accepted by those around us, I pray that we will have the courage to live with confidence and conviction of love, unity, service, intimacy, purpose. It is out of time in the garden that we are strengthened to face the joys and the challenges that face us each day. Do we have the same attitudes as Jesus in tackling our challenges? Do we start in the garden? When we're facing challenges of carrying our cross, do we start in the garden? Because as Max Lucado says, it is so often it is there that the battle is won or lost. Peter comes to the garden bearing arms, carrying a sword, ready to attack. Jesus comes holding a cup. And the strength to drink the cup came from time with his Father. Not my will, but yours. Only happens through that time. Otherwise, our will always win. The cross is the greatest act of love in history. But the battle took place in the garden. Let's not live Peter's two extremes, but let's live in the tension between the two. If we are going to be a redemptive presence in our world, we need to spend regular time with him in the garden. Because that is where the battle is fought. Let's pray. Father, I just thank you for your example, for all the teachings of the upper room, and all that we have learned through them.